Peter. Good morning, everyone. And once again, thank you for joining us today for the 2021 first installment of the SOLVE virtual lecture series. My name is Jorge Beltran, and I'm one of the student board members of SOLVE, Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL. And I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Luke Harding, who will give the lecture entitled Language Assessment, Current Trends, Future Challenges. I actually had the pleasure of virtually meeting Dr. Harding last fall when I participated in a session of his research group, a language testing research group at Lancaster University. And I'm excited to hear what Dr. Luke Harding has to share today. And I'm certain we'll have a very thought-provoking discussion throughout the Q&A portion of the session. So if you're familiar with the literature in language assessment, you've certainly come across some of Dr. Harding's extensive publications. But for our new students, here's a quick summary of Dr. Harding's experience. So Dr. Harding is a professor in linguistics and English language at Lancaster University in the UK. His research interests are in the area of language assessment and applied linguistics, and some of his work has been on listening assessment, pronunciation assessment, and intelligibility, world Englishes, English as a lingua franca, and communicative language assessment, language assessment literacy, diagnostic language assessment, etc. So he is also co-editor of the journal Language Testing, which most of you must be familiar with. It's one of the most prestigious ones in the field. And he has done editorial work for several other journals. So he is also active, very active in the language testing community. He participated in last year's webinar of ELTA's Graduate Student Assembly publishing webinar. So you've certainly seen some of his work. And this was me trying to keep it short, but without further ado, please join me virtually welcoming Dr. Harding to start the lecture.
Right, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to give a talk today. As Jorge said, my name's Luke Harding and I'm from Lancaster University in the UK. And the topic of my talk is language assessment, current trends and future challenges. Just in case you've never been there, these are some images of Lancaster University. We're in the northwest of England, just south of the Lake District, to the west of the Yorkshire Dales, so a very beautiful area. And we have a very beautiful campus as well. I haven't actually been able to get onto campus now for almost a year because of our lockdown restrictions and so on. But if you ever get the chance, once things return to normal, these are some of the scenes that would greet you if you come to Lancaster. So the topic or the title, I just wanted to give a quick note. I mean, it's a fairly broad title. And I chose this title because I was asked by Peter Kim, one of the organizers who you heard from earlier, if I could talk about something along the lines of future implications of assessment, thinking about assessment during the pandemic, and some of the longer term consequences that we might see. And this request kind of tied in nicely with some of the issues that I've been thinking about over the past year myself. And so the aim of this talk is really just to think through some of the trends that we're seeing now in language assessment and to consider particular future challenges that we might need to face or that we can anticipate based on these trends. And I should add that these are very much my own thoughts, my own musings on these themes, and you might have a very, very different perspective. But I've been told there's lots of time for discussion at the end. So I'm really hoping we'll have an interesting and vibrant discussion at the end of my talk. So I want to start just by providing two perspectives on current trends. First, the trends that can be sort of specifically related to the pandemic, and second, what we might call the more general trends in the research literature that have been emerging over the past few years. So on the first one, COVID-19 transformations in assessment practices. I just need to, there we go. I just needed to collapse the images of people on the screen so I can see my full screen now. So in terms of transformations in assessment practices, I think that, the pandemic has raise lots of interesting challenges for language assessors and those who take language assessments. But probably the two big ones are, firstly, the cancellation of in-person exams. And this situation, which occurred across many countries, many contexts, led to some sort of secondary consequences. So, for example, the rapid creation and large-scale uptake of take-at-home exams, and we've seen very thorough review of some of these take-at-home exams in the work of Isbell and Kreml, a review article in Language Testing. And also I noticed a new special issue of Language Assessment Quarterly, which is to be published fairly soon. Where there are a lot of papers online just in the past 1 or 2 weeks. So this sort of shift towards take-at-home exams was very obvious, very apparent over the year, and led to lots of discussion among language testers and people involved in language assessment. I think we've also seen a greater emphasis in some contexts on in-house language assessments being sort of ramped up or repurposed for high stakes decisions. So, in some institutions, academic institutions, for example, people working on EAP programs might have been told, right, we need to use this test now to test hundreds of people or thousands of people, whereas previously, it had been a much smaller scale operation. So these were the sort of disruptive effects of the cancellation of in-person exams. Another very interesting byproduct, I think, of the pandemic, at least in the UK, is I've noticed a wider awareness and sort of greater level of public discussion around assessment issues. And this is in the news media, on social media, and so on. So, for example, there's been a lot of discussion in the press here about the fairness of different contingencies for cancelled exams. So here's an example of a headline from the middle of 2020 in the UK. The A-level exams, which are the end of secondary school leaving exams, were cancelled because of COVID restrictions and replaced initially with a very controversial algorithm which determined results based on predicted grades and so on. But that algorithm was found to be very unfair, and that solution was then replaced again with using teachers' grades. And all of these steps along the way have been met with lots of debate in the media and so on. It's very interesting for someone interested in assessment to see these debates playing out, in a public forum about fairness, about reliability, consistency, and so on. Another interesting issue of public discussion during the pandemic has been around the limits or affordances of technology. So one of the very interesting innovations that has occurred over the past year is this mass use of remote proctoring. And of course, remote proctoring has many benefits for take-at-home exams and so on, but also raises lots of interesting and tricky ethical issues around surveillance, data ethics, and safeguarding. And so all of these issues were also discussed in the public sphere. So these were some of the current trends, I think, over the past year around assessment that sort of caught my attention. In terms of more general trends in the research literature, I can speak about this, I think, from a position of being an editor. As Jorge mentioned in the introduction, I've been co-editing the journal Language Testing with my colleague Paula Winke for several years. And being an editor on a journal like Language Testing gives me a very fortunate position to see all the really interesting and fascinating research that's submitted to the journal. So I get to kind of get a sense of movements and shifts in the field. I've also recently been co-editing with Glenn Fulcher a second edition of the Routledge Handbook of Language Testing. So the first edition was edited by Glenn and Fred Davidson, and I'm working with Glenn the second edition. And again, working on that book has given some insights into the sort of newer or emerging trends from the first edition to the second edition, looking at how authors have updated or changed their chapters. And so I talked about this actually with my colleagues in the editorial office at Language Testing, Paula and Dylan Burton. And I sort of came up with a list of what I think are some of the current trends, the sort of hot topics, I guess, in language assessment at the moment. Technology, of course, and so lots of issues arising around test development, test delivery, and test validation, and the role of technology in all of that. Learning-oriented assessment and classroom-based approaches seem to be becoming more popular. Assessing interactional and pragmatic competence, which has been a hot topic for a while. We've had a special issue in language testing, but there's also been lots and lots of other publications in that area. Longitudinal perspectives on language learning and language testing, I think, are becoming increasingly common. And again, we had a special issue in language testing just last year on repeat test taking. And then the assessment of young learners has really emerged in the past few years as a very interesting and vibrant research area. And we have a special issue of that coming out soon in language testing and language assessment literacy, which seems, at least for the past sort of 5 or 6 years, to have been a real sort of perennial topic at any language testing conference. And we receive a lot of submissions on language assessment literacy to the Language Testing Journal. So these, I think, are some of the current trends in sort of general language assessment literature. Now, in the talk today, I just want to sort of pull out 3 themes. And I'm going to talk about each of these themes in a little bit more detail. The first is the changing nature of communication practices. The second is the shift towards connecting assessment with learning. And the third is a critical awareness of language ideologies in language assessment. And I'm going to try and talk about these themes and connect these back to some of these emerging trends that I've talked about in the previous slides. But I also think that each of these 3 themes has another sort of sub-theme running through it, and that's the role and influence of digital technology. And I think that will become apparent as I go through and discuss each of these themes. So to start with, let's look at the changing nature of communicative practices. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, we're in the middle of something like a digital revolution in language assessment. Maybe revolution is a strong word, but I kind of feel like it is a revolution. Technology is sort of influencing and affecting every level of language assessment practice. And I'm drawing, in this slide, somewhat on the work of Schmidgall and Powers, who wrote a great chapter in 2017 on technology in high-stakes tests. But we can see technology in areas like item and task construction. So we use technology now for sort of online platforms, automatic item generation. Technology is there in the item development stage itself. We see technology, of course, in assessment delivery, so online platforms for online computer-based delivery, recording, speaking assessments, and so on, storage of data, lots of technology around security in language assessment as well. We see technology in scoring. Obviously, automated scoring systems are a very big part of new language assessment practices now. And also automated feedback systems, so in areas like diagnostic assessment. And we see technology really in a big way in validation, in the kind of research we do around language assessment. So natural language processing tools for linguistic analysis, so cometrics and so on, eye tracking, EEG, all of these new technologies are really being taken up in language assessment practice. But one area where I think that perhaps we could see more discussion, or at least we may begin to see more discussion, is in domain description. So basically this idea of trying to understand how our communicative practices are changing in the real world and how that might influence how we are designing assessments. So on this topic of changing communicative practices, Isbell and Kreml actually had a very nice quote in their article where they said the full potential of innovation in computer-delivered testing has not been fully taken advantage of. Online tests could potentially allow for more interactivity, multimodality, and more authentic representations of today's communication and target language use domains than has been possible in traditional paper-based tests administered in secure test centers. So we're seeing here a call for harnessing technology in a way that helps us to capture better, how we are using language now, how we are actually engaging in communicative tasks in this online environment that we're all actually participating in as I speak. So the key question here is, how can we harness technology to explore richer, more authentic constructs of language use? So we first need, if we're going to answer this question, we first need to understand the nature of communicative demands or practices across domains of use. And we are starting to see some research that can be very helpful. So, for example, a very recent paper published just last year, which looked at changing communication practices during the pandemic. This was a survey conducted in early April with 1,374 US adults. And not surprisingly, they found that there has been a vast increase in digital communication. So they saw increased use of text messaging, voice calls, social media, video calls, email, online games, and so on. Certainly in my own household, this is absolutely true. And I'm sure for many of you, watching this presentation, you will relate to this kind of finding that over the past 12 months, your online presence, let's say, has increased. It's not just sort of general context as well, but professional contexts. So we're seeing these shifts, I think, affecting how we can understand communicative competence. So again, last year, a very recent editorial in the journal Critical Care, a health related journal, this really stood out to me actually as explaining some of the challenges that health professionals are dealing with in the needing to use technology, in their communicative practices. So this editorial said to be highly effective, communication in medical encounters must capitalize on both verbal and non-verbal aspects. Both of these have been highly compromised in the COVID-19 experiences, both in hotbed sites and in affected but more controlled settings. Our information is given by telephone, video call, or email, and physicians have the challenging aim of compensating for these egregious communication gaps through other non-verbal tools, such as the tone of our voice, pause, and inflection. So I think in this editorial, we can see this idea that the need to use different kinds of communicative practices is actually affecting communication at the linguistic level. So our communicative competence is changing as well. Now, of course, these kinds of changes to the domain or the criterion, they challenge our assessments. So this is McNamara's sort of model of the relationship between the test and the criterion. The criterion is the domain. So we we characterize essential features of the domain, and we try to model those in our test tasks. But our test tasks, then we make observations about performance on the test, and we draw inferences from performance on our tests for performance in the real world. So there's this sort of symbiotic relationship between the criterion or the domain and the test itself. And disruption or change in the criterion must necessarily lead to disruption and change in the test. Okay, so I think that should be fairly clear. Now, there may be a temptation or an instinct to think that, yes, I mean, this is the pandemic, we've all had to move online, but things will go back to normal. We should perhaps treat these as short-term or temporary changes. But researchers have been exploring new technology-driven constructs prior to the pandemic. So we've seen work in recent years on video conferencing by Nakatsuhara and colleagues, work on speaking assessments in virtual environments by Oki and colleagues, and lots of work on multimodal listening comprehension by Batty, Gruber, and many others. So I think future challenges in this area, in terms of changing communicative practices, we need to go further, I think. I think we need to firstly develop innovative prototype tasks that can be trialed and ultimately used alongside or in place of existing assessment tasks. But I think we need to look, at least we need to revisit and really interrogate the kinds of communicative tasks we're engaged in these days on a day-to-day basis. And I think that in the future, we're going to be seeing things like interactional, or the need to assess interactional competence in group chat, using things like WhatsApp and so on. Interactive lecture listening with a chat bar down the side. Now in our university, we're giving lectures, but students are replying, in real time in the chat to questions. Collaborative writing, and this is something Uta Knock has written about in a forthcoming chapter. So using Google Docs or similar kinds of software to collaborate and to produce a text that's not just a single author's vision, but multiple authors working together. And then thinking about younger learners as well, I'm thinking about things like narrating plans or processes while playing a computer game. These are very, very common videos now of people narrating gameplay, on YouTube. And also, thinking ahead to the increased use of AI assistants and the sort of communicative skills that may be required to communicate effectively with an AI assistant. And it may require accommodation, for example, to make yourself understood. So essentially what we're looking at here, I think, in terms of future challenges is a shift towards a multimodal digital literacy, and perhaps away from these isolated focuses on individual skills, and towards a more integrated and holistic approach where technology is embedded. The other thing I think that we need to consider in terms of future challenges is existing tests need to take account of this new blended approach to communication. So I think that in order to support extrapolation inferences of existing tests, so this idea of how much a test matches, real world ability, then we need to see new validation arguments being put forward for a lot of the tests that are currently out there and in use. And just to give you an example of something we're currently doing at Lancaster, we've got a project with the British Council looking at the where we've developed an apttus speaking corpus. So this is a corpus of over 600,000 words of spoken performance data from 865 speakers from a range of backgrounds and CEFR levels. And what we're doing at the moment with this corpus is we're looking at this relationship between the language produced in the corpus, and we're comparing it with other corpora, which include online communication. So at the moment, my colleagues, Dana Gablasova and Vasa Brezina, have been doing a multi-dimensional analysis using the British National Corpus Baby Corpus, which is a 5 million word corpus representing a range of genres and speech, including speech and also e-language. And they've found some very interesting initial results in their analyses, their preliminary analyses looking at these sort of different registers and so on, they've found that, you know, in terms of involved versus informational language, or sort of lexicogrammar, aptus is sort of up there at a similar, you know, clustering with informal speech. Okay, but in narrative and versus descriptive types of texts, aptus is somewhat closer to sort of email and SMS communication. And in academic versus non-academic, aptus is sort of there nearby to forums and email. So there's this sort of very interesting, these are very interesting results for us as we're looking at this data and trying to figure out what does this mean for the kind of extrapolation inference that can be made about the language produced in aptus. So I'm going to move on to the second theme, and that's a shift towards connecting assessment with learning. So there's a growing interest in connecting assessment with learning, and also with embedding assessment in learning. And there's various different paradigms, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these: learning-oriented assessment, classroom-based assessment, diagnostic assessment, dynamic assessment. They all offer different approaches to this notion of connecting assessment and learning, you know, but there are also many overlaps as well. What's interesting, I think, in terms of the pandemic is that we have seen, at least from my perspective, a shift away from this vision of one-shot high-stakes exams as the best solutions, or the best type of assessment. Very recently, at the end of last year, Linda Taylor, who's the president of UCALTA, our UK Association of Language Testing and Assessment, Linda and I co-authored this think piece for the Campaign for Social Science here in the UK around assessment literacy and assessment literacy in the time of coronavirus. And one of the points we made there was that the COVID-19 situation highlighted the reality that high stakes end of school exams are high risk endeavors if something goes wrong. And this strengthens the case for a greater emphasis on continuous assessment, assessment for learning, learning-oriented assessment, not only as a better approach pedagogically, but also a more risk-averse approach. So I think we will start to see more of a trend towards classroom-based continuous assessment, partly, you know, because of these pedagogical reasons. We know that assessment connected with learning is a good thing, but also because, you know, it is a very risky endeavor to have a one-shot high-stakes exam where everybody sort of gathers in a hall on a particular day. But in terms of this general idea of connecting assessment with learning, I think even before the pandemic, we've been starting to see lots and lots of very interesting research, and particularly this idea of drawing digital technology in to classroom assessment and, you know, diagnostic approaches and so on. So a very interesting study by Mures and colleagues, which was actually presented in some detail at a YALTA conference in 2018. This group of researchers used computational methods to track learning in the wild. So they were you know, introducing a range of computer-based tasks, and then logging, you know, interactions with tasks and with feedback, monitoring uptake of particular language features over the, you know, a very long period of, I think, up to a year. And they were then able to combine all of these measures with other measures of working memory capacity, aptitude, proficiency, and so on, all within the classroom context. So this is all within the sort of regular task-based learning that these learners were doing. But the fact that it was on a computer allowed for all of these data metrics to be produced. And the argument is that this kind of tracking, as they say, in the wild, allows for a sort of deep ecological validity and deep insights into language learning over time and in a very authentic environment. We can see some of these ideas also coming into diagnostic assessment. So some colleagues and I at Lancaster have been working on revamping the Dialang test. Some of you will be familiar with the old Dialang test, which was produced some time back by a consortium of universities in Europe. And we've been thinking through how to develop Dialang 2.0, so a new kind of diagnostic assessment. And this is based on some of the work that my colleagues and I have done on diagnostic assessment over the years. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but I think the important thing to understand about our thinking here is that new approaches to diagnostic assessment are not necessarily just focused on language and language skills, but may also try to draw in other measures of motivation, working memory, metacognition, and so on that could feed into diagnostic decisions, all delivered through an online system. And this idea of broadening diagnostic assessment, using technology to draw more informed decisions is also supported by Zhang and Sinclair in a forthcoming chapter on diagnostic assessment, where they say process-oriented multi-channel data, and they're talking about the kind of data that will be required in diagnosis in the future, will involve physiological, neural, affective, behavioral, and metacognitive traces. So we're going to start to see diagnostic assessment and other kinds of classroom assessment really drawing on a huge range of metrics, a huge range of affordances from technology, I think, pupil dilation, maybe even heart rate and so on. I'm not sure where that's going, but it's the kind of thing that we might see. The future challenge here, of course, is does more data lead to better decisions? And I'm not sure about that, actually, because someone still needs to draw together all of these disparate sources of data to make useful assessment decisions that will help learners improve. A brief snapshot of some research in progress. A PhD student at Lancaster, Keith Maneri, has been doing case studies of EAP teachers who are dealing at the moment, like right at this point in time, with a quick switch to online assessment in their teaching environments during the pandemic. So it's very, very current research, very important research, I think. And one of the emerging findings that Keith is seeing is that the teachers are just absolutely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data that can be collected in virtual classrooms. So there's so many opportunities for gathering information and metrics around engagement with tasks and so on. But also, as we know, teachers are very, very time poor, and they don't necessarily have the time to digest and condense all of this information. So what do we do with all of this information? And will we be able to still make good decisions with more and more metrics? So this also, leads to secondary questions like how do we deal with ethical issues around the continuous collection of data and constant surveillance. So although I think the integration of technology in learning-oriented assessment is a very promising, something we should welcome, it's not without its limitations and challenges. Now, the third theme I want to bring up is this notion of critical awareness of language ideologies and language assessment. So during the pandemic, 2020 has also shone a light on inequalities, discrimination, and ideologies that underpin a whole range of social injustices. and this is very much in the news in the United States, but also around the world as well. And this is something that Paula and I have commented on in a recent editorial in language testing. In language assessment, there has been a tradition of focusing on fairness issues, justice issues in language assessment research. But I would say that we still have a long way to go to catch up with adjacent fields such as applied linguistics, English language teaching, of course, sociolinguistics, and so on. One case in point is the issue of accentism or native speakerism, which is being discussed more and more in recent years. So to give you a definition here, accentism is a term which refers to linguistic discrimination, also linguicism or languagism. In the sense that we are using it here, it describes any situation in which an individual feels as though they have been unfairly judged, treated, or commented on because of the way they speak, write, and communicate more broadly. And this definition I'm drawing from a website called the Accentism Project, which you can check out. There's a very interesting website. Applied linguistics research has demonstrated that accentism is experienced by international students in Australia, international teaching assistants in Canada. But you might be thinking, well, what's the relationship with language assessment and these kinds of issues of accentism and discrimination? Well, the history of pronunciation assessment is a sort of tricky one. There's been a history of a conflation of accent and intelligibility in scales for pronunciation for some time. And this is something that Talia Isaacs has written a lot about, and I've written with her as well. So if we look at some of the earlier versions of speaking tests, for example, the speak test, the criteria in that test used to range from heavily accented and unintelligible at its lowest level up to near native at its highest level. So this sort of assumption that intelligibility and accent are kind of synonymous and can be measured at the same sort of rate. But recent research has demonstrated that accent and intelligibility are separate constructs, and the field has been moving towards a more intelligibility-based approach. So we can see here on the slide the TOEFL IBT descriptor for delivery at level 4 in the TOEFL speaking doesn't mention accent at all, doesn't mention native-like or anything like that. It's really focused very much on intelligibility. So these are sort of welcome developments in the field over the past 10, 20 years. In my own research, I've been very interested in a lingua franca approach, which shifts even further towards a focus on accommodation and repertoires in order to negotiate meaning. And together with Tim McNamara, we've written about defining an English as a lingua franca construct with this sort of focus on how meaning is made within fluid and dynamic contexts of language use. And this kind of view of communication is in line with a general shift towards rich meaning-based constructs in language assessment. So, and some examples there of people who are working on related areas. So, in some sense, I think the field of language assessment conceptually has moved much more towards a sort of meaning-based approach to language assessment, very interested in authentic, rich constructs of language use. But the question is technology taking us back? And particularly this area of automated scoring, is, I think, a very, very tricky one to navigate. So Van Moor and Suzuki have written that with respect to pronunciation and automated scoring. They say from a software modeling point of view, the option of having just one variety of English as the reference would be the easiest computational way to discriminate very accurately among learners who have that pronunciation and those who do not. But as more accents and pronunciations are included in the reference model, it becomes more ambiguous and poorer at discriminating among learners. So we have this sort of tension here with automated scoring, where it's computationally easier to keep things simple in terms of models against which pronunciation is compared. Now, some of the larger scale test providers are grappling with this, I think, and trying to kind of maintain an intelligibility focus. But we're actually starting to see in some of the computer assisted pronunciation training apps that are out there a shift back to a nativeness kind of model. So, for example, there's a product called Native Accent by Carnegie Speech Assessment, which is a computer-assisted pronunciation training program. And they say, it will provide rapid assessment of spoken English by analyzing each student's speech against a statistical composite voice model of native speakers. In very recent research, Valashak explored a whole range of free CAPT apps available in Google Play and identified 296 different apps. So there's actually a lot of pronunciation learning apps out there. But the predominant models across these apps were prestige native speaker varieties. So I feel like we're starting to see this sort of creep back of the nativeness approach in pronunciation in these technology mediated environments. So I think future challenges here are that we need to start to sort of unpack ideologies that are baked in to scoring algorithms through critical examination. And this also requires us to increase learners or test takers' awareness of scoring models, values, and assumptions underlying scoring models. So we need to sort of try and make those visible and make those plain. We need to investigate impact and washback of automated scoring and feedback systems, particularly in low stakes classroom settings where they may have, really undesirable effects if we're not careful. But at the same time, we can harness technology, particularly with pronunciation assessment, to provide more choice of models or norms for different learner populations, and also to develop authentic interactive tasks to assess repair skills, negotiation of meaning, accommodation, and so on in online communication. So there's lots of opportunities as well, I think. So I'm going to come to a close here, and I'm going to sort of look ahead. There's my sort of picture of a crystal ball here. I think there's sort of two visions that we can imagine based on current trends. One is the utopian vision. We could start to imagine language assessment as becoming sort of more localized, stakeholder-led, context-sensitive, inclusive and diverse, connected with learning, informed by theory at a deep level, using rich and authentic constructs, providing a longitudinal perspective, and with a deep consideration of justice. Do we need to assess? And why? We need to avoid, over-assessing, and we need to be very mindful of why we're assessing at all times. I think this is a sort of utopian vision, and we can imagine ways in which technology, for example, could be used in ways to sort of, provide opportunities for these kinds of visions to come to fruition. At the same time, we can also imagine a dystopian kind of situation. I'm a big fan of a TV series, Black Mirror, and this is a sort of dystopian Black Mirror kind of view of language assessment. Centralized and uniform, top down, one size fits all, focused on standardized native speaker centric models of language use, disconnected from learning. atheoretical and actually informed by expediency. So what's easiest, what's cheapest, what's the least complex. Focused on narrow constructs, focused on one-shot high-stakes instances of assessment. And because of its cheapness and affordability, I suppose, and simplicity, a proliferation of assessment with more gatekeeping and leading to more barriers. So I think, there's probably some sort of middle ground, I'm sure, but I thought it was interesting just to think through this sort of utopian and dystopian view. And we can imagine that either path could be chosen based on the kind of current trends that we're seeing. So how do we steer clear of the dystopian path and go towards the utopian path? Well, I think that there's sort of two sides to the equation. On the one side, we need to promote the social responsibility of assessment providers and users. And this requires, among people who create tests, responsible for tests, a strong commitment to ethics, to impact and consequences, to transparency, and to accountability. On the other side, we need to develop a critical language assessment literacy among test takers and other stakeholders. So this actually would require a sort of broader view, I think, of language assessment literacy. Some of the work that has been done so far in assessment literacy, and I've been involved in that as well, perhaps hasn't taken into account sufficiently the role of technology and the way in which it's accelerating certain trends in language assessment. So a broader view of assessment literacy would include a sort of data literacy, algorithmic literacy, and I think very importantly, an understanding of test takers' legal rights and protections. I think we're going to start to see more of this in the coming years, legal challenges against test providers, and test takers should be aware of their legal rights and protections. And this sort of two sides of the equation, what I mean by this is that language assessment is a very unregulated space, right? So there's not many people necessarily who are holding assessment providers accountable. So we need an informed citizenry. That's the language assessment literacy side. And the informed citizenry will help to hold those with power to be more accountable. So this kind of relationship, I think we're thinking of here, or I'm thinking of here, is actually a sort of democratic relationship. And of course, Ilana Shohami has written about this, almost 20 years ago, way ahead of her time, or certainly of this time, thinking ahead to democratic language assessment practices. And she's talking about these principles that need to be in place for there to be democratic assessment. To apply critical language testing, to look at consequences, to conduct and administer testing in collaboration and in cooperation with those tested. The need for those involved in testing to assume responsibility for the tests and their uses. The need to consider and include knowledge of different groups in designing tests, and the need to protect the rights of test takers. So these are very, very powerful principles, I think, and made even more important by this digital revolution where dynamics of power are shifting, processes of assessment are becoming less transparent, assessments involving a wider array of professionals who are not traditionally involved in assessment, people in NLP, speech scientists, security specialists, and so on. While at the same time, expertise in assessment technology becomes more concentrated. So I'm going to finish just by imagining what this how this could work, what kind of mechanism could allow us to achieve this more sort of democratic language assessment in the digital age. And I think my colleague Benjamin Kreml and I have been thinking a lot about this, and this notion of multidisciplinary innovation. So starting with language assessment professionals, of course, bringing in technology professionals, where we have a sort of shared space of collaboration to develop language assessments in a sort of socially responsible way, but also very importantly, bringing in these other groups, SLA researchers to tell us about learning, sociolinguists to tell us about language use and ideology, pedagogy experts to tell us about what works in the classroom, and putting test takers and test users right there in the center of this kind of collaboration. So I'm going to finish there because, I hope that what I've said I know it's a fairly whirlwind tour of lots of different themes, but the idea was to sort of be thought-provoking and generate some good discussion. So I'm going to stop there. Oh, and I would just like to acknowledge lots of people who've helped me in discussing all these ideas over the past year or so. They're all listed here. They may not necessarily support all the ideas, but they've certainly helped me in my thinking. And if you're interested in a sort of longer exploration of technology and ethics, there's a sort of YouTube video there from a talk I gave at the New Directions conference at the end of last year, if you're interested. These are my references. I'll just quickly go through them. Okay, and I'll finish there, and I look forward to seeing what kind of questions you've got.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Harding. A lot of great topics, information, themes, and also, I believe, very timely considering the current circumstances that we're in, and so much the dependence that language assessment now has on technology. As Dr. Harding mentioned, now comes the fun part, right? It's the Q&A session where you get to ask him, what's on your mind, questions you may have. So I would encourage you, everyone, to use the Q&A function if possible, and then if other questions that you may have, you can also raise questions. So I'll start with the first question here. We have 4 so far.
Peter, can I just ask you, should I stop sharing my screen or should I leave it up there?
I think you can leave it up there.
Okay.
In case you need to reference back to a slide.
Good point. Okay.
So the first question is, it says, it's from an anonymous attendee. You talked about the relationship between authentic interaction and assessment and the evolution of communicative practices. This makes sense for constructs. However, what about mode? How closely do you think assessment developers need to consider the way the assessment is delivered in relation to, say, the way in which learning takes place in a classroom? Can we assume that technology is embedded in a classroom and therefore can be embedded in assessment? Or does this make a test inaccessible to those that haven't learned through that mode? So a lot to unpack there, multiple questions.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'm just looking at that question as well. I think that the key there, at least that I'm getting, is how can a test be made inaccessible to those who haven't learned through that mode? So perhaps if there's an assessment which, for example, let's just say very basically is computer-based, then if learners haven't been doing computer-based tasks, in the learning environment, is that a fair kind of assessment? I'm not sure if I've interpreted that correctly, but what I would say is, it's a very good point, and of course there needs to be kind of fairness. I think that perhaps I personally feel there's a bit of a shift, though. I think that there might be an assumption now that, face-to-face or written exams are still the default, right? I'm not sure that that's the case anymore for younger learners. I think younger learners in particular are really engaging so much with digital domains, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom. that it may end up being that in a few years, things like handwriting an essay is actually seen as something that is somewhat unfair to those children who may not have as much experience with that mode. So yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. It takes a lot of consideration, of course, of your test-taking population and what you know about those learners, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Harding. The next question also comes from an anonymous attendee, and I'll read it out loud. What about regimes of normativity that have dominated language assessment research for the past several decades? Isn't the time for commercial gatekeeping assessment products to give way to more inclusive testing practices? In the age of anti-racism and decolonization, talking about devising tools to assess norms seemed already archaic.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I very much agree with this anonymous attendee. And in fact, as I said in the talk, and I think I had to sort of rush through that section a little bit, in my own work on lingua franca communication, I think we sort of need to move past norms. We need to look at how language is used effectively in context-bound situations of language use. I think it's going to take a very long time to get from where we are now with large-scale assessment practices to that kind of vision. And I think it requires people who are doing language assessment research to take up that task of trying to figure out how to create useful assessments that move us beyond these let's say regimes of normativity, and actually provide us with the information that we need to make decisions. And this also connects with the idea of not over testing. This attendee has mentioned gatekeeping assessment products. Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to be very vigilant about the overreach of assessments for purposes where either they were not originally designed, or for purposes where there isn't a strong risk management objective around assessment. So these are really interesting critical comments, and yeah, I think there's a lot to discuss here and think about.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Micah.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference in the degree of correlation between intelligibility and accent at different levels of listening proficiency? That is a low-level listener who mainly hears accent A more likely to find accent B unintelligible than is a mid-level listener who mainly hears accent A? As a related note, in the US government interagency language roundtable skill level descriptions for speaking, their lower level descriptions say something like understood by a native speaker used to dealing with non-native speakers, indicating that intelligibility isn't a unitary construct.
Thank you. That's a really great set of questions. I think on the first, there's sort of two parts there. I would say on the first part around proficiency and intelligibility, yes, I mean, I think that obviously from a listener's perspective, a listener can draw on, let's say a high proficiency listener should theoretically be able to draw on higher order sort of cognitive processes, right? Top-down skills when they're listening to a less intelligible speaker to be able to sort of have a better communicative success, I suppose, with that particular speaker. Whereas a lower proficiency listener may be, more taxed, I think, at the decoding level and may not be able to draw on those higher order skills. So I think that, I think in that way we may see a sort of proficiency impact in intelligibility. And of course, as this person asking the question has noted, there's also a familiarity effect there as well. But in my own research, I found that familiarity with an accent an unfamiliar accent can come very rapidly. I did some research, small scale research study, but listeners listened to a totally unfamiliar accent and got used to it, in about a minute or so, maybe 2 minutes. On the second point about the intelligibility being not being a unitary construct, yes, and in fact, I would say intelligibility is a relative construct, and I think most people working with intelligibility would agree with that. And this is what makes it an extremely challenging construct for language assessment, because if it's a relative construct, so if it's co-constructed between speaker and listener, as we know it is, then who is the ideal listener? Or is there an ideal listener? It all comes down, I think, to your purpose. And that's why I was talking earlier about localization of testing approaches. If you have a test in Singapore, and you are using raters from the UK, who maybe find a particular speaker less intelligible, well, that could be a problem, right? It's not a problem for the speaker, it's a problem for the rater. If you get a rater who is best placed to replicate the kind of listener who that speaker will encounter, then that's fairer, I think. But there's a lot there to unpack, but they're very good questions. Yeah, I hope I've addressed it.
Thank you, Dr. Luke. Dr. Harding. Another anonymous attendee mentioned, could you speak about the role of self-assessment in democratizing language assessment?
Yeah, great question. I'm becoming more interested in self-assessment myself, and certainly in our diagnostic approach, we put self-assessment as a very central feature of a diagnostic process, because it's a bit like when you go to the doctor, the doctor says to you, how do you feel? What's wrong? And you tell them. And the information that learners have about their own difficulties or their own challenges in language learning is very, very useful. And it will help to create a sort of more fine-grained diagnostic decision about where a learner might need some assistance. So I think self-assessment is very useful in that sense. In terms of democratizing language assessment, I think that, again, it puts the learner in the center. The learner has a voice, and it may not be that self-assessment is the end point, of the assessment, but self-assessment should be feeding into a lot of our assessments, I think. And of course, we also know that self-assessment is good pedagogically. It helps learners to improve, it creates better self-efficacy, all of those things. So self-assessment, it has so many advantages. I'm kind of surprised that it doesn't happen more. But I think it's got a bit of a stigma attached to it because of reliability concerns and consistency. But I think that's to kind of misunderstand the benefits of self-assessment. So yeah, I think it plays a central role in democratizing language assessment.
Thank you. Next question. Just apologies in advance if I mispronounce your name. Chihiro. Thank you, Luke, full of insights. Fully agree that we need to move more towards more continuous assessment away from one-off end of term sort of exams. But how can we help teachers deal with the increased demand for more classroom-based assessment? Are we moving this huge responsibility for grading students for high stakes purposes from language testing organizations onto teachers who haven't been trained in assessment?
Thanks, Chihiro. I know Chihiro, and thank you for the question. It's a great question. I don't think I have a good answer, to be honest. There could still be a role for, let's say more formal tests, I think, external tests, if we like. Perhaps the answer is that they shouldn't count for as much as they do. They shouldn't be weighed as heavily as they are, and that teacher assessments can be integrated usefully with that information from external assessments. So I don't necessarily think it's a case of choosing. It could be a case of getting multiple pieces of evidence and putting them all together to make a decision. So I think that's probably the answer to one part of the question. The question about how to equip teachers, I think that's actually a really important consideration, because teachers, are so busy, and I think the last thing they want is sort of more assessment responsibilities, or having to assess more often. I think that, again, that could be solved by combining different assessment types, but thinking carefully about how to weigh up the different pieces of evidence, and making a case for multiple observation. I think that's really what it comes down to. I don't think the teachers necessarily need to be doing what we might call high stakes assessment. What they perhaps need to be doing is gathering, really useful, good quality evidence that will help in making that high stakes decision at some point down the line. But yeah, there's also a role for assessment literacy there as well, and for bringing teachers in, I think, to designing these sort of more external assessments and giving their insights as well.
Thank you, Dr. Harding. I think the next question is also a bit related to the previous one. Mohammed, thank you for your question. It says, is it possible for teachers around the world to reach such a high level of digital literacy? And don't you think it can, again, create a new kind of inequality?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really, really an important consideration. And something I haven't talked about here is, the sort of inequalities that are part and parcel of this digital revolution, right? And we know that in the UK, for example, that homeschooling, as I'm doing, at the moment with my own children, different families are finding that easier or more difficult depending on how many devices they have, the strength of their broadband, and so on. So there's inequalities there. In terms of teachers, level of digital literacy, yes, absolutely. I think this is something that, again, needs to be context dependent. I'm not necessarily suggesting, I think, that this will work in every context around the world, but I think in the contexts where, digital practices are changing, then, we need to be aware of that. I do think that, from what I know from teachers I speak to in different parts of the world, this shift towards online and digital is happening, in many, many places, but at different levels, in different ways. And that's, again, why I came back to that utopian vision. I think that context-sensitive assessment is absolutely crucial, and the one-size-fits-all approach is sort of a recipe for disaster, and so I think that's perhaps the best answer I can give at the moment.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from an anonymous attendee. What are the implications for AI and computer-based tests for young learners? I guess you can also think of it in context of the current state of affairs, being everybody is learning from home, especially with the schools being closed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so actually in the Routledge handbook that I mentioned, there's a great chapter that will be in that by Yuko Butler on young learner assessment. And she makes the point that young learners, their literacy practices are being radically changed in many places through digital technology. And I think that young learners, if we think about primary age children or secondary school children, I think that they will be, in many cases, I'm not saying this is sort of universal, but in many cases they will be much more familiar with computer-based learning and AI than we are, or than I am. My daughter is 12 and she's reached the age now where she gets very frustrated with me if I'm doing anything technical, on a computer. She just says, please just let me do it, and I think a lot of parents have experienced that as well. I sort of feel like perhaps we worry too much about this, and that computer familiarity and so on is just sort of part and parcel now of many young people's lives. In terms of implications for tests, you know, I do feel that young learner assessment is a great place for technology to be introduced, you know, because if nothing else, I think that young learners find technology very engaging, you know, and I think that if we can, you know, start to introduce it in young learner assessments, I think it will be, you know, very good, you know, very good move. So yeah, that's what I would say. I think it's probably quite a big question, and I'm not a young learner assessment specialist, so I could defer to others perhaps on the call who are also young learner assessment specialists.
Okay, just a few more questions.
Yeah.
From Susan. The comments about the auto-scoring algorithms using one native speaker model for accuracy assume this refers to assessment of speaking, which is problematic for an ELF view, so English language assessment as a foreign in a foreign context. Can you comment on this issue for writing? Is it perhaps parallel, or is the one model perhaps less problematic?
Thank you, Susan, and hello. Yeah, I was talking, as I often do, you know, very, what's the word, without reflecting very much on, I'm, you know, much more drawn to the sort of oral speaking and listening skills, as you probably know, and so I do talk about those more often. And yes, you know, the example with the automated scoring algorithm is very much, you know, problematic from an ELF view. In terms of writing, you know, this is a really interesting question, and I think that there has been some work on, well, not I think, there has been some work on lingua franca competence in writing, and I think there are parallels. Of course, you know, writing to some extent, I think we often think more in terms of disciplinary conventions, for example. So perhaps there are sort of slightly more restricted limits on you know, communicative effectiveness in writing as compared to speaking. I'm not sure that it's parallel, but I do think it is an issue. You know, I think that as an editor, for example, in the journal, you know, one of the things that I'm very conscious of is trying to align my editing work with my sort of views as a researcher. So, you know, we have to be respectful of different varieties, World English varieties, different types of communicative practices. And I think with writing, you know, there's also a sort of tendency to correct things which are communicatively effective, you know, and they may be innovations. They may be innovations in different, you know, varieties of English. And I think we just have to become more knowledgeable about this, both as assessors, as editors, as anyone who has a role in making any kind of judgment. I think there's a strong responsibility to know as much as possible about the infinite variety of language, you know. And my concern with automated scoring is, you know, it has the potential to become a very reductive model. And that's a problem in itself. But a secondary problem is that tests have power, as we know, and that once there's a model, a reductive model in place in tests, that then has a sort of influence on the whole educational ecosystem. And so that's, I think, something that we just have to guard against. And the only way to do it is to be more informed, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Harding. We do have to apologize. We still have a lot of questions that are left unanswered, but we are out of time. So
I can try and answer some of these in the, you know, I could try and type answers later if that helps.
Okay, I think we can. We can do that, type answers, but I think for now we'll have to come to a close. We are out of time.
If anyone wants to email me, go ahead, and my email is l.harding@ lancaster.ac.uk. But if there's a way to save these at all, Peter, I'm happy to then, respond to people.
Okay, thank you. I think that would be best if people have questions. You're gracious enough to allow people to email you directly with these questions. I think that would work best. So please email Dr. Harding if you still have questions that we weren't able to address today. Well, thank you, Dr. Harding. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today online on a very interesting, very important topic of language assessment, current trends and future challenges. And please look to us, as we will be uploading the entire lecture on our YouTube channel. We'll also be tweeting about the link as well. And just a last round of applause, virtual applause for Dr. Harding. Thank you once again, and we'll see everyone later. Thank you.
Thank you.